All right, so thank you guys for joining us. We've got with us today, obviously, we're continuing our celebration here, our tribute to the late, great Bob Nalbandian. I'd like to welcome to the show here, or I should say to this tribute. We'll start on the bottom now. We've got Mr. Richie Waddell, who's from Focus on Metal Podcast. And, of course, on the top right there, we've got Mr. Tom Brennan, who's co-hosted some Skull Sessions and was a guest, of course, as well. Thanks, guys, for coming on and agreeing to do this and talk about Bob. I know, when the four of us, myself, Bob, and you two, did the Skull Sessions episode about 2 years ago. So, you guys were talking about how, you guys obviously big fans of Skull Sessions when you still living in Ireland. Now he almost had sort of a little fan club back there in a way with you guys. So I guess just go ahead and we'll start with you, Richie. I mean, talk a little bit about, the first time, I guess, you're in Bob with Skull Sessions and really, I guess, how much I know he's influenced you into doing the podcasting world as well that you're doing now with Focus on Metal.
Yeah, well, Bob's name, I probably heard it over the years in magazines, and it's kind of a name that stands out. And so I was looking for podcasts about, I think Bob started doing it probably about 15 years ago or so. And at the time, there wasn't really anything like that, where me and Scott just did an episode talking about Bob. And it really was like a discussion you'd have in a pub with your mates. But Bob was doing it as an audio episode. And he had great guests on. And I always liked that sort of discussion, and I really enjoyed the early episodes that he did. He had some great guests on that he knew from when he was a lot younger, who wrote for magazines or were in the record industry. And some of the discography episodes he did were fantastic. I mentioned on our show the one he did with Bill Ward doing the Sabbath discography, and that had a massive influence on me. And I, luckily enough, in Focus on Metal, I've been doing it for 10 years now. I've been able to get some musicians on and pick their brains about albums that they did. And a lot of that came from Bob. I just really enjoyed the episodes that he did. And they weren't all the same either, And he talked about a lot of bands that around that time period he started the show, there weren't a lot of people talking about them. Like he'd talk about bands like Rainbow and Early Maiden and some early LA thrash metal bands that weren't that big. And he'd go into detail with it. He'd have guys on and he'd talk about, about their influences and stuff like that. And I think around the time Bob started doing it, there was a lot of newer metal bands that were being talked about. And there was a market for the older bands to be talked about in greater detail. And I think Bob did that.
And like I said, I did listen to that episode you guys did. I thought it was a great job you did.
Yeah,
Cheers. Yeah. So what about you, Tom? I mean, I guess just talk about really what got you into Skull Sessions, and obviously, and talk about how actually you came into contact with Bob and, wound up becoming a co-host for a few episodes with him as well.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for the opportunity, Matt, to be here. It's an honor to be among these esteemed guests I know you have coming up. When everyone gets together. And I had to dig out my Rainbow shirt tonight because I know that was probably Bob's favorite album ever, if I'm not mistaken. And then coincidentally, the new classic rock came in today with, Long Live Rock and Roll on the cover. So it's meant to be for Bob tonight. But Richie is involved here somewhere. Richie, can correct me on the timelines, but you had been, I think I'm here 8 years or 9 years. You're here like 11 or 12 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I think you sent me on, say, hey, there's this great podcast, talking about metal or whatever. I think my first question was like, what the fuck is a podcast? Like, this is 2010.
Yeah.
And you said, well, like, there's this guy called Bob Nalbandian and whatever. So I listened to it. Again, I don't know if you're in the States or not. And I listened to it and I was just blown away by just the content. I can't remember what the podcast was or who it was about, but it was definitely outside of bands that I have really been aware of, because he was talking about, the Sunset Strip maybe from 78 up to 81, whereas we would have jumped on board a Kerrang when we recorded really from 81 onwards. And he was talking about Snow and all these great bands, and that comes up all the time. I was going, fuck me, like what? This is a whole story that I've never heard before or never heard much of it. And now I was hearing from a guy who was actually there, not just a reporter pulling clips from old, magazines, whatever, and piecing them together. So this is around 2010. I still have that email. I sent Bob an email and said, "Hey Bob, my name is Tom, living in Ireland. I'm now a big fan of the show, whatever." And then he sent me back a note basically within 24 hours. Now, from where I was in Ireland at the time, there's an 8-hour time difference, and within 24 hours, he was back on board. Saying, "Hey, thanks for tuning in, and we've got a lot of European listeners." And because he used to always give his email right at the end of the show, shockwaves@gmail.com or Skullsessions, whatever it was. And so I just connected with him, and then I would send him an email from time to time. Never spoke with him. I moved to the US in 2014, and at that point, I created a Facebook page. I never had Facebook before that. I actually don't have it now. I got rid of it, right? I hate it. But during that time, then Bob connected with me on just like the friend or follow friend, whatever, add a friend. And that was kind of it. And there was no real conversation. And then I had a work gig in San Francisco in early 2020, just before the pandemic, early March, actually. And I posted that on Facebook, and then Bob sent me a note, and I remember sending you a note. Rich was going, "You're not going to fucking believe this. Bob Nalbandian wants to meet me for a beer." It might as well have been James Hetfield. I swear to God, I had held the guy in such esteem and been a fan. This is like, 3 years ago, and I'd been listening for 10 years previous, and I was going to meet him. And we, connected, and I did the work gig, and Bob came in. I was doing a whiskey tasting in the event, and I saw Bob in the corner. I kind of said, "Go over there, get to the whiskey." So he was propping up the bar. We had this make-up whiskey stand. He was, doing that. I was doing my thing, ran over, give a big fucking man hug, one of these kind of things. And then we, I just said, "Give me an hour. I got to do it. I got to do it." "Yeah, man, whatever, do what you got to do." And he lived about 10 minutes away, I remember, from the event. So we did the event, went for dinner afterwards with another colleague of mine. And then Bob just went pure Bob mode. Again, going back into the gigs he was at, and we saw AC/DC on the Highway to Hell tour, and he was talking about all these different bands and whatever. And then right at the end of it, right at the end of the evening, then I couldn't remember where I parked my car. It was one of these big, huge fuck-off shopping malls with about 16 entrances. And I had no idea what entrance I had come out of. And we were at a different side of the store. And then Bob said, "I know the mall. I know the mall pretty well. So it's kind of a loop." And we just walked around for about 30 minutes looking for my car. So that was my one-on-one time with him, just chit-chat and talking about music. And we mentioned you, Richie, and obviously, Chris and the CMS guys or whatever. And that was how the conversation began, exchange numbers. And we had been in contact pretty much ever since.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that sounds just so much like Bob. That's how he was like. It was like just one little thing he'd find in common with you, and next thing you become good friends with him. That's how he was. Now, Richie, I know, like I said, I was listening to your tribute to Scott, and it was fantastic. And you both were talking about really just how influential he was on both of you guys in terms of really starting the podcast or getting into the podcasting world. I mean, myself too. I mean, he was obviously, when he started doing the Skull Sessions and I started listening to it years ago, it definitely gave me sort of an impetus to want to start doing something similar. So for yourself, and when you joined into, Focus on Metal, I mean, was it just the Skull Sessions in general? Was that really what got you really started, or at least the wheels turned in your head to want to get involved in doing something like podcasting?
Definitely Skull Sessions got the wheels turning. And from there, you'd find other ones. I think when the Skull Sessions came out, maybe I was bad at looking, but there wasn't a lot of them. And over time, of course, the market got saturated because everybody could then do a podcast. But what really interested me with Bob's one was the bands that he talked about and the way he did it. It wasn't a question and answer interview. This is my new album, and that's all we're going to talk about kind of thing. It was more in-depth, knowledgeable, more opinionated. One thing I really liked about Bob's show, he wasn't beholden to a sponsor, so there was no strict format or things that he could and couldn't talk about. And they talked about everything. Like they'd say if such an album was crap, Bob had no problem saying, "Nah, don't like it, it's crap," and they'd put it on the air. But if you were beholden to a commercial sponsor, there's certain things you can't say, and you're not going to get a guy on the show with his new album and tell him, "Oh, by the way, your new album's crap."
Sucks, yeah.
But Bob's show was conversational. There was great debates on it as well, and he covered certain topics about the music business that piqued my interest as well.
Yeah.
And of course, the one thing he did have, he had the knowledge.
Yeah.
He was there when it all happened. He had, he had the experience. As Tommy said, he wasn't somebody, reading from a book or being handed a list of questions. Here's what you have to answer. The great thing Bob had that I found was he didn't have to write down the questions, but he'd always have a question to ask the person based on what they just said, because he had the knowledge. And that's what I found really good about Bob. And another thing Tommy brought up there, I was emailing Bob over the years as well, always answered
every
emails.
time.
Every single time. And it was never just a couple of lines. It was always like a paragraph or 2 paragraphs. Very gracious. Always there to help. If you need any help, Richie, give me a shout. If you need me to try and get in contact with someone, give me a shout. I'll see what I can do. And the funny thing that happened one time was Bob contacts me and he says, do you know how to get in contact with Mick Wall, the English journalist?
Oh, yeah.
And I hooked him up with Mick Wall, and he had Mick Wall on the Skull Sessions. So that made me pretty happy.
Yeah.
Sure,
yeah.
No, I think you brought up a great point, Richie, is, I mean, Bob, like you said, he returned everybody's messages. I mean, he would treat you like you were the same if you were James Hetfield. He treated everyone like a rock star, the way he was a person. And obviously with Tom, I know, I guess I mentioned before, he had you co-host, obviously, a bunch of Skull Sessions. And obviously that's Bob. If he saw something in you that he, saw something in you that was like, wow, okay, this guy's got either this kind of knowledge or whatever it is, he always brought you on board and tried to put you on a pedestal and try to give you like sort of a boost. He gave people chances that, like, even myself included, that probably didn't really even deserve to have that chance. And then, I same with you in terms of just being, you obviously weren't someone who was in the music business or anything, but he saw something in you that made him want to bring you on the Skull Sessions. That right there, I think, speaks volumes, obviously, with what he did, obviously having you on as well.
Yeah, and actually that was a great conversation. I remember well, the 4 of us when Bob was there, and that he asked me actually that night looking for the car, because I text Richie. I text Richie that night and said, Bob was interested in having us on. I was going like, fuck me, like I just had a conversation like just a couple of hours ago. So obviously, and because we were talking about rock and metal, he said, okay, I'm not going to for 1 minute say that I have the knowledge that Bob has. Not going to happen, but I could hold my own in a conversation about whatever. So he obviously recognized that, and in his own head he was thinking, hang on a second, now I can get a podcast out of this, because I got 2 European guys. I'm going to give a totally different perspective. 2 fanboys growing up in Ireland and then going to European concerts in the mid-1980s, and that was probably something he hadn't covered before. So immediately he recognized an angle, and I never contacted him back on that, because I didn't want to be, hey Bob, when is this happening, just in case he's blowing smoke on my ass, just to be nice, whatever. He then contacted us and said, well, okay, when are we doing it? So he didn't forget about it, and Matt, I was looking back on some of the texts that, and Bob and I actually kept in contact quite a lot over the last couple of months or so. And I went to an Anthrax and a BLS concert back in probably, I don't know, maybe June, July, whatever, when the tour was. And I said, I put you on the thread, Matt, and Joey Bella was standing up doing this, like, Charlotte, you're number 1. And I caught him doing this. And I said, Bob, Joey Belladonna just said you're the number 1 cunt in California, right? And Matt, he said something like, he's obviously a man of good taste or something like that. Irish fuck, mind your own business, whatever he said. I don't know, just fun shit like that all the time,
Yeah, well, that is the one thing that I think some people don't know about Bob. He's got such this great radio voice, and he puts you at ease. But he was a major ball buster. I mean, he loved busting balls with people. I mean, it's like it's like he had this other sort of part to him. Obviously, in a very very good manner. Not in a malicious way at all. But he loved to bust chops and bust balls, man. That was the one thing. I know you guys did a lot of that through our emails and everything. So yeah.
Well, he did it all the time. I mean, I don't know if he did it, but he used to call me like an Irish fuck, or hey leprechaun, what are you doing, or whatever.
Yeah.
The text to prove it, and I remember just the time looking for the car again. That was a kind of a real key 30 minutes, and I was telling him because like Richie and I are big fans of the CMS for many years, and now Aftershocks and Tremors and the whole kit and caboodle. But I remember I was telling Bob about this, and Bob then was texting Chris Aiken as we were looking for my car, saying, "Hey, I'm with some guy, Tom Brennan." And the first time I called in, Chris hung up on me, which
Oh, really?
he tends to do. No surprise there, right? And
Yeah,
then he
yeah.
was talking about whatever. I can't remember what the conversation was, but you know, he was busting my balls. He'd met me 10 minutes before. He busted my balls about being hung up on the classic metal show. But to your point, Matt, he had this side of him that was a real ball buster for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, the one thing I remember fondly about Bob was his relationship with Chris and Neely on the classic metal show.
Mhm.
If you have to have certain stones to go on that show.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're going to give it, right?
Oh, yeah.
And Bob could take it, but Bob could give it back to him as well. And he used to call just as a guest. He'd be listening to the show, and he'd call in, and he'd spend like half an hour just shooting the shit with Chris and Neely. And this was a common thing because I used to I didn't listen to the show live that often, but Chris would do the podcast or Neely would, and they'd nearly podcast the whole show in clips. And Bob was on it a lot.
Oh, yeah. I think they said 30. I think Chris counted 35 times he was on there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was. He was a
He
regular.
used to call in sometimes because he wouldn't agree. Used to, Chris and him would clash on air about something, and Chris could be talking about something in particular. Neely would then go quiet, let the two guys at it, and and they were good friends. I know Chris was really cut up when I watched that the day. I think it was the day he died or the next day, and that was a tough show to watch, but they had to do it, I guess. But Bob would ring in sometimes, and he'd call in and he'd go after Chris if he didn't agree with him, and they would fucking have it out on air. And I think Chris respected that. They might have agreed, but he respected his opinion. Then he'd just sign off and go about his day or whatever.
Oh yeah. And like I said, and he still, they would do that. And those two always had some great battles, obviously even with their Megadeth battle a year and a half ago or so, whatever.
That's right.
That whole thing.
That's right.
That's right. David Ellefson. That was the one that that went on for a while. The two of them really went at it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I think that was one of the ones I've probably seen Bob more passionate on that than I've ever seen on any podcast before. Yeah, he was real passionate about that. Another thing I was going to say about Bob and one thing he's done, obviously, that he was great at doing. I always say was he connected people so well together. He would just sort of bring you into his circle, his world, and next thing you know, you would become friends with all of his friends. And and I mean, obviously, I wound up becoming co-host with Chris, doing Aftershocks because of Bob. Obviously, I met Chris through Bob. I met obviously you guys through Bob, and that's just, it's great to see because there's so many people that he connects other people with, and he'd love just to see those relationships kind of flourish as well. And it's something I know that he cherished really probably more than anything in his life was connecting people and just building and watching other people build relationships, not just himself but with themselves. And so, like I said, I know that. So,
on that particular point, Matt, even when he brought me on a couple of the Skull sessions, but he and I then interviewed Bob Daisley. Speaking of,
that's right.
This, and I was during the interview, I was like going, I'm fucking talking to Bob Daisley. I got everything ever recorded, ever. And I was going, holy shit balls, this is unbelievable. And I was able to ask him questions that I wanted to ask. And Bob just said, just go for it. I don't want to see your questions. Just ask him whatever you want. And actually, and I know I have not been in contact with Bob Daisley since, but I was guessing because I think Bob lives in Sydney that he hadn't heard about Bob Nalbandian. And I just shot Bob Daisley a message, not even expect him to remember me for a minute. But I know that he had interviewed Bob Daisley a couple of times, obviously with his retrospective, but about the Gary Moore tribute album a couple of years ago. That's an incredible album and a brilliant interview. Anyone to go back on that. But I just sent Bob Daisley a quick email and said, hey, Bob, you mightn't have heard, whatever. And he came back and he was just, I think I sent you a screenshot of that, Matt. But
yeah, you did.
Bob was really upset by this. And he said, wow, I've just lost so many friends over the years. This is a tough one. And I think he said something like, may he rest in peace. And he said, well, I know he's at peace, but I'm not quite sure if he's resting, something along those lines. typical Bob Daisley putting it into some kind of concept. But
Mhm.
you know, but you're right about that. Is that connection? You know, Matt and I, we would chit chat from time to time because of Bob, and now, you know, I'm kind of, I watched the CMS because of Richie, who was connected with Bob. So this is all these tentacles of the man himself, like still going on, you know, because
Absolutely.
and he never had an agenda. Never had
No.
an agenda, not one time.
No. Yeah, he was never looking for anything from anybody, you know, and that was very unique about him, you know, someone in the music business who didn't have an agenda and wasn't looking to, you know, he didn't promote himself very much, you know, he just put stuff out there and let people, you know, take with it with what they may. And, you know, I think that's, you know, another testament just of his character, you know, what a great guy he was. Just once again, you guys, thanks for coming on. But I want to just give you guys just, if, you know, maybe say one last thing about Bob to, you know, everyone who's watching this, and you know, if you had, I guess, one more thing to say to him, what would you say? And, you know, just kind of your farewell to him, if you don't mind.
Wow. That's a hard one because there's a lot, you know. I'm just glad for the friendship I had with him. Tommy, you've been lucky. You got to meet him. He asked me numerous times to come out there for the premiere of the Inside Metal, and I could never go. And it's one of these things now, you know, when something like this happens, you kind of you regret it now because you know, we're all getting older now, and you always think, that I can go next week, or I'll go in 6 months, or I'll go the next time. And you know, I've lost a few people now over the last few years, one or two other people that were listeners on the show. Yeah. And it hurts. It hits hard.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just glad for everything he did for me. And when it comes to the podcasting and all that as well, I said it on my show, I wouldn't be doing Focus on Metal if he hadn't have, you know, sown the seeds in my brain to go and do that. And in a lot of ways, it was, you know, it was the DIY aspect of it that he brought to me as well, that it was like, I can do this. You know, I don't have to be on commercial radio to do it, or a local radio station. I can do it myself in my own house from the grassroots up, and do a show that a lot of people will like. And Bob was really good at doing that. And I think that's sums it all up really for me.
Yeah.
I think for me, well said, Richie. I think for me was, I was trying to understand when you text me, Matt, you know, when he died, I think the 30th of December, I think it was, you just sent me a note, and I was going, I couldn't believe it. And then I was actually like bringing the dogs for a walk an hour later. I was genuinely upset. I said, why am I so upset? I don't know him that well, you know, but I do know him. He was he had a something, a charisma, knowledge, a fun aspect, whatever it was. But you know, I would urge everybody out there, particularly if you're new, maybe you jumped on the Skull Sessions maybe a year ago and you don't know the backstory on Bob or whatever, is go back and listen to the early Skull Sessions. I think they started in 2006 or whatever. I went back and listened to them. I don't remember listening to the shows from 10 years ago, but you're getting re-educated again and listen to the best live albums of the 70s or the best live albums of the 80s, whatever. There's huge education in going back and listening to that. Put me onto a shit ton of music that I was aware of but not really in depth on. So I would urge everybody to do that. And just for me, like he was just a great guy, and it was just an incredible shame what happened and how quickly it happened. I was glad I got to meet them and kept in contact with them. And I think the last text I had from Bob a couple of months ago was him busting my balls again, like literally. And I'm laughing reading back on it. It's actually really funny to read. So, you know, just I miss him. I miss him hearing his voice and shooting the shit and just jumping on board with CMS and busting Chris's balls too. But there's great knowledge out there that still exists through video and YouTube and whatever. I urge everybody, go back and check those out, because there's a lot of information in there. And he was a musical guy, we get it, but he was just a fucking good man. And I think that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's being a good man. That's number one. That's exactly what he was. And we're actually going to, you know, go ahead and I'm going to be re-releasing those early Skull Sessions. Good. So I'm going to set up like its own channel so that everything's just in one channel, all Bob's stuff pretty much. Well, thanks guys. Hey, thanks so much for coming on and doing this on there.
Thank you, Matt, for asking us. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Appreciate it.
No, I don't.